But yes, we were going to kick off. My first guest, we've got a bit to discuss. We are going to look at first home buyers increasingly relying on flatmates to help secure mortgages. That was not around when I was after a mortgage, that's for sure. And how some major banks are easing requirements, including just a declaration of intent. Aucklanders are expected to receive their new property valuations in the next couple of weeks. It affects 630,000 properties. And of course, that'll be used to set the rates. We're going to look at Tauranga Council, their love of murals at the cost of $300,000 to the ratepayer. Geez, I'll do it for $3,000. Just give me a crayon, I'll go down there. The Green Party's alternate reality budget, also we'll talk about the real budget, and the government blindsiding opposition yesterday in the House by deferring the punishment for 3 Te Pāti Māori MPs until next month. So there's lots to talk about. So joining me now is market and political commentator Ashley Church. Ash, good morning. See, fell at the first hurdle. So used to the afternoon.
What sort of ungodly hour do you call this?
I know, right? I'm normally in my gym jams.
Yeah, well, I'm not quite in my gym jams, but I've had my first coffee and my head's just starting to get clear. So anyway, nice to talk to you, Leah.
Nice to talk to you. Well, actually, if the truth be known, I don't own gym jams, but here we go. Ashley, what a thought. First home buyers are increasingly relying on flatmates to help secure their mortgages, and banks are easing their requirements. Some now accept just a declaration of intent, even instead of a boarder's letter. But that's quite a bit of a trust move from the banks, isn't it?
Well, it is, but look, there's two parts to the story. The first part is the fact that the banks are actually accepting declaration of income from flatmates. But look, that's actually not that huge a precedent. They've been doing that with landlords in residential investment property for decades. So, because it's exactly the same principle. If you buy a residential investment property, the bank accepts your undertaking that you're going to tenant that property and that the income from that's going to go toward paying off the mortgage. So the principle's the same. So in that regard, I think it's a good thing. And by doing that, it increases the buying power of potential first-home buyers. I think I read somewhere that every $200 extra per week in income, so for example, somebody paying a couple of $100 toward the rent, increases your buying power by about 150,000. So, yeah. So it's pretty significant. But the flip side of that for me is just the hypocrisy by the banks, because on the one hand, we've had banks telling us over the last few years, or putting us through sort of the eye of a needle in terms of income and some of the things that we spend money on in order to qualify for a loan, and making it extraordinarily difficult. Yeah. And then suddenly when it suits the banks, they turn around and they do this. So what it does tell us is that there is an opportunity for banks to relax their lending criteria quite significantly. And, it's not as if the banks have had a tough time while the rest of us have. They've been appropriating huge fortunes off to Australia over the last few years, while the rest of the country's been wallowing essentially in a recession. So good move, but they could go a lot further.
Actually, that's a good point, Ash. I'd forgotten about the fact that, they used to go through it with a fine-tooth comb and question whether you'd bought 1 or 2 lattes for the week and some smashed avocado on toast. And now they're just asking for a letter of intent from a boarder. But what I think has changed, you said this has been around for a while, but they don't necessarily have to hold them to it. So I could say, yeah, I'm going to get a boarder and I'm going to get a flatmate to help me pay. But then I may not even get that border, and they don't
But care. The principle is the same. The principle is the same with a property investor, because when you buy an investment property, you're not required by the bank to indicate that you have a tenant already.
Yeah, but this is first-home buyers, not investors.
Yes, it is. No, the point I'm making though is that this isn't unprecedented. They've been doing it with that class of people for a long time. All they're doing now is extending it over the first-home buyers as well. So the potential to do it's always been there. They've just decided for whatever reason that that for a long time that they were going to crack the whip on a certain class of buyer, and now they're making that a little bit easier, which is great.
It is great. Aucklanders are expected to receive new property valuations in the next couple of weeks. It's going to be used to set rates, a proposal of 5.8% rise. And the way the market has been, there is an expectation that the average property valuation will be down, Ash, if taken from 2021. So not really good news to look forward to.
No, so a couple of interesting things about this. Firstly, these valuations are a year overdue. So the last time the Auckland Council did their registered valuations was back in July 2021. So they're normally done every 3 years. This will make it almost 4 years when these ones are finally released. Although I don't know that that's going to make a huge amount of difference because, as you say, property values have decreased over the last 2 or 3 years. Most of that decrease took place in the 2 years following 2021. They dropped in Auckland by, on average, about 22%, which is huge. Haven't changed much over the last year. So what it does mean is that when these finally come out, they're going to be quite a bit lower than they would have been back in July 2021, although they will still be 15% higher than they were 5 years ago. So we need to put that in some perspective.
Yeah.
The question becomes then how accurate or how valid they are. And you probably know my view on this, Leah. I'm not particularly a fan of RVs as anything other than a method by which councils determine how much the average punter should pay in rates. In terms of valuing your property, they're not much better than toilet paper from my perspective.
Is that where yours go, in the bathroom?
Well, real estate agents tend to use them as the guide, and they tend
Yes,
to use
they
them
do.
as a way of indicating to people what their property's worth. But there are other more accurate methods for doing that. So there'll be an interesting
Which is
dinner
what, Ash?
party
It's market,
conversation.
isn't it? It's the market
Yeah,
sets it.
totally.
Yeah.
Totally. So as I say, there'll be an interesting dinner party conversation piece, but I don't think there'll be much else. And the other point that you might want to question me on is whether or not they're actually going to have an impact on how much you pay in rates. And the answer to that is no. They don't directly impact on your rates for the simple reason that the council knows how much it needs to collect. If the average rate's gone down and your neighbours has gone down as well, then you're still going to pay what you would have paid otherwise.
Yeah. And of course, you can contest your valuation. More than 9,000 objections were made to the council in 2021. So I'm sure there'll be more this time around.
Interestingly, because traditionally I think what's happened is people have often objected because they've been too high. And so they have seen them, and they've believed that because they were too high, they were going to impact on their rates adversely, and so they've objected and got the council to bring them down. I think you might find if there's objections this time, there'll be people objecting because they're too low, or they think they're too low. Because particularly if you're looking to sell a house and it's gone from nay level to nay level over 2 or 3 years, you might find people going to the council and saying, hey, that's not a real reflection of what my house is actually worth.
Yeah. Now, this one caught my eye, Ash, and it's really just a bit of a giggle because, well, you'll know the topic when I tell you, but the Tenancy Compliance and Investigations team are going around this week in Dunedin, apparently, checking student rentals to see that landlords are complying with the healthy home standards which come into force in July. Now, why this made me laugh, Ashley, is because maybe how about the students don't put holes in the wall or rip up carpets or use wall cavities to throw rubbish into? You know?
I was trying to play devil's advocate on this and trying to think about it from the perspective of the Tenancy Tribunal. And I guess if I was sort of to squint and stand on one leg, I kind of get it. So what they're basically saying is, hey, it's, there's this perception that if you go to Dunedin and you're a uni student, that you're going to live in a hovel, basically. And that's not necessarily true. And there are still standards and that landlords are still required to adhere to them. So I get that. I understand the point you're trying to make, and it keeps them in the media. But you're absolutely right. Maybe we need, if that's the case, then we need to change the culture of students themselves, particularly in places like Castle Street, which is the famous road leading up to the Otago Uni. That's it's almost a rite of passage to destroy it and burn couches and what have you in your first year of uni. So there's kind of two sides to this, which I think is being missed in this article.
I mean, I'll be honest, I didn't go to university down there, and but we did venture down there for part of a radio thing that we did years ago, and some of those houses you wouldn't even put your dog in, and that's because the students themselves were living in this filth and destroying the houses, and they went, well, the landlord knows we do it and they don't care and we don't care and the rent's good, and when we move out they just get insurance, fix it up, and then move on to the next lot of yobbos.
So as I understand it, and my niece was in one of these a few years back when she was doing a law degree down there. So as I understand it, you only spend your first year in these hovels. And you're right. I mean, it's almost an expectation. It's kind of like your induction into Otago Uni, and then you sort of grow up a little bit in your second year and you go and get a real flat where you spend the rest of your time. So that culture is prevalent. Interestingly, she lived directly across the road from 660 Castle Street, which of course is where the band 660 comes from.
Yeah.
That was where they started.
I mean, I don't I don't want to sound like high and mighty, and I don't have kids, but I'd be devastated if my kids went down and lived like that. Like if they wanted to live in I'd grow up.
Yeah.
Just grow up. That's what I would
Yeah,
say.
yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, perhaps you and I are getting a little old, but
it's too early in the morning to say that word to me, but yeah, maybe we are, or I am. Hey, Ash, before we move on to other topics, we've had a couple of texts saying, Leah, could you ask Ashley how many more years until my house is worth what I paid? As I thought prices only went up, says Andrew.
Yes. So interesting. That's a really good question. So if you'd asked me that question anytime up until about 2020, I could have given you an answer that was pretty much bang on. And the reason for that was I'd examined 40 years of capital growth, and had a pretty good handle on how property prices worked in this country, when they went up, when they stayed flat. Last 4 years we've been in no man's land. And I don't mind admitting to you, Leah, I've had a couple of years where I've been basically predicting that the market will start to rise again, and it hasn't. And there's a whole, I've got the time today. There's a whole range of reasons for that. But what it does mean is that I'm very hesitant now to say this is when it's going to happen. I can tell you it will happen. I can tell you that your house prices will at some point get beyond where they were in 2021. But I'm reticent to say when that's likely to be, for the simple reason that we are in this weird Reserve Bank created environment. Reserve Bank created this environment in 2021 and has pretty much carried it on over the last 2 or 3 years. But until we come out of this, and God knows when that's going to be, no one knows. Seriously.
So Andrew, that's
Sorry,
truth.
Andrew.
No,
Sorry, Andrew.